All right, here we go. Today we have legendary lawyer and former professor emeritus at Harvard University, Alan Dershowitz, who over his career worked on cases involving Mike Tyson, O.J. Simpson, Nelson Mandela, Jeffrey Epstein, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, and Donald Trump. Welcome to VladTV.
Glad to be on. Thank you.
Well, I want to get into your whole story, but right now, because of what's happening right now with the Trump indictments, I want to talk about that first, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So you've spoken a lot about this, and Trump has 4 cases right now. And what's your overall feel on these cases? Do you think at the end of the whole process, do you think he'll ultimately go to prison, or do you think he'll walk away from all this?
I don't believe that Donald Trump will go to prison. I do believe that he will be convicted in New York City and in Washington, D.C., where the jury pools will be overwhelmingly anti-Trump. But I think there's a good chance that those convictions will be reversed on appeal. I think the greatest danger he faces is in the Georgia state case, because a RICO conviction, racketeer influence corrupt organization conviction, carries with it a mandatory prison term, but I don't predict he will actually ever serve time in prison. Having said that, I've read all 4 of the indictments very carefully. I predicted them all in my book, Get Trump. In my book, Get Trump, I went through each of the indictments and predicted how they would come out. And I was right on those predictions. I also said, and I still believe, that you don't go after the man running against the incumbent president of the United States unless you have the strongest slam dunk case. You should have a confession, an admission, overwhelming evidence. Otherwise, it becomes a vendetta. Otherwise, it becomes a political action in which one administration is trying to imprison the person running against that, the head of that administration. And that's Banana Republic. And I don't want us ever to become Ecuador, in which people who run for president are killed, or in which people who run for president are in prison, unless the case is crystal clear. And I call that the Richard Nixon standard. The evidence against Richard Nixon was so overwhelming, racing tapes, bribing witnesses, obstructing justice, that even Republicans and independents agreed that he should be impeached, prosecuted. The only thing that saved him from certain imprisonment was obviously President Ford's heroic decision to try to heal the nation by pardoning him. I think the nation, in this case, could be healed very much if these prosecutions were dropped, but they're not going to be dropped. They're going to go to trial, and we'll see mixed results at the trial.
Okay, so let's break down the 4 cases. The first one was in New York, which was the hush money case of Stormy Daniels, which is 34 counts of falsifying business records. Now, you've said this is the worst case you've seen in 60 years of law.
That's right. I've never seen a weaker prosecution. Imagine the implications of the case. The theory of the case is if you pay hush money, that is, if you pay money, the purpose of which is to make sure the scandal doesn't come out, the way Alexander Hamilton paid hush money to a woman with whom he had an affair in the 1790s. The theory of the case is if you pay hush money, you then have to publicly reveal it in a corporate form. Why would anybody in the world ever pay hush money if they had to reveal it? There's been no case in the history of America, I don't think there's been a case in the history of the world, where anybody has been prosecuted for not publicly revealing the fact that he legitimately and legally paid hush money. It's an absurd embarrassment to the New York legal system, and it should result in an immediate dismissal of the charges. But it won't, because the very large percentage of people in Manhattan, where the case is being tried, voted against Trump, and they're very anti-Trump. It's not only they voted against him, they hate him. They're afraid of him. They are emotional about it. And it's going to be very hard for him to get not only a fair jury, but a fair judge.
Okay, so then there's the Fed case for the documents, which is 31 counts of willfully retaining national defense information under the Espionage Act, and 1 count of making false statements. And jointly with his personal aide, there is a count of obstructing justice, withholding government documents, corruptly concealing records, concealing a document in a federal investigation, scheming to conceal their efforts. I guess that has to do with Trump allegedly telling him to delete some of the video footage.
That's right.
And you actually said this is the strongest case.
This is the strongest case on the facts and on the law. That is, they have overwhelming evidence. They have a videotape of him actually waving a document that they claim they can prove is classified and that Trump knew was classified in front of a journalist and a publisher with Trump saying, I could have declassified this when I was president. I didn't. It's still secret. That's a smoking gun. And they will get a conviction on that. The problem is it's not that serious a case. President Biden had classified material. Vice President Pence had classified material. I bet you that other previous presidents also have and had classified material at home. So there should be a conviction in that case on the classified material, but it's not a very serious charge. The obstruction of justice is a much more serious charge, but the evidence there seems very weak. They don't seem to have any direct testimony that Trump actually asked somebody to erase the tapes, and apparently the tapes were never erased. So that's going to be a harder case to prove.
Okay, and in that case, if he's found guilty, what do you think will happen?
It would be a suspended sentence, probation, probably a fine, but there's never been a case like this where a person has gotten prison term. The closest case, a much worse case, is Sandy Berger, the former national security advisor, who willfully and deliberately put classified secret material in his socks, took them out for purposes of helping him write his book. He got a slap on the wrist, and that's probably what would happen in this case.
Okay, then there's the Fed case in D.C. for trying to overturn the election. 4 counts for his efforts to overturn the 2020 election, charged with conspiring with unnamed co-conspirators to defraud the United States, obstruct the certification of the Electoral College vote, and deprive people of the civil right to vote and having their votes counted, as well as obstructing an official proceeding. What do you think of this case?
Well, I think the case is strong if they can prove that Donald Trump actually believed and actually knew that the election was fair. If they can prove that Donald Trump told somebody, or there's a videotape, or there's a letter, an email, something that proves his state of mind, that he actually knew the election was fair and that he just lied to everybody deliberately in order to regain the presidency corruptly, that would be a strong, clear case. A strong case on the facts, a strong case on the law, and a very serious charge. Problem is, I don't think it's true. I think that Donald Trump, for whatever reason, actually believed and still believes that the election was stolen. It may be wishful thinking, it may be a delusion, but it's an actual belief that he has. And if he has that belief and the government can't disprove that, it's going to be a hard case. Now, there are 2 types of instructions that can be given in a case like this. One would be, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if you find that Trump honestly, subjectively believed the election was stolen, you must acquit. The second, and he'd win on that. The second instruction would be a much harder one for him, and that is, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, even if you believe that Donald Trump subjectively believed he had won the election, that belief must be reasonable. And if the belief must be reasonable, then I think jurors would find that it was not reasonable. After all, these are reasonable people, these jurors, and probably most of the jurors don't believe the election was stolen. So it will depend on the instruction. It will depend on where the trial is held. In the District of Columbia, 95% of the voters voted against Donald Trump, the single highest vote against Donald Trump anywhere in the United States. That case should be moved to a different location, Southern Virginia, which is purple, or his team wants to move it to West Virginia, which obviously would favor him, but it should be moved out of the District of Columbia. That seems very, very clear.
Well, right, that's where January 6th happened. So obviously the people in that community are still outraged.
They're victims.
There's still the loss.
They're victims. Almost everybody must know somebody who was there, somebody who's related to a police officer, somebody who is related to somebody who worked in the Capitol. After all, what's the biggest industry in the District of Columbia? It's called government.
Right. Right. Now, you worked with Trump directly. I mean, without giving up, lawyer-client privilege, I mean, does he really believe that this election was stolen?
I haven't spoken to him since the end of his term in office when this whole thing occurred. I only spoke to him a few times when I defended him on the floor of the Senate against very different charges. But from what I know about Donald Trump, he talks himself into things. And I think he's talked himself into the claim that he won the election. Remember, Donald Trump cannot bear being a loser. That's the worst word you can use to him. I actually suggested on television that he not run for a second term because I knew he was going to lose. By the way, I predicted in my writings that he would win in 2016 and that he would lose in 2020. And what I said on television, he should announce, look, in 4 years, I've accomplished more than any president since George Washington. I don't need a second term the way others do. I'm going to go back to make money in business and help humanity. He would have been much better off doing that because he can't bear the fact of being called a loser. And I think he persuaded himself that he was not a loser in the 2020 election. But the reality is he lost.
Right. So you believe that the election was not stolen?
Oh, absolutely believe the election was fair. It was there were problems with the election. There were problems with machines. There were problems with late voting in Pennsylvania. All kind of problems, as there are in every election. Look, I was deeply involved in challenging the election of 2000, Bush versus Gore. That case was filled. We all remember the hanging chairs, the butterfly ballots, the polls that closed too early. People were still online. That was one of the worst elections in history. This was to use Donald Trump's overused term, this was a near perfect election compared to the 2000 election itself. So although there were problems with it, Biden won fair and square.
Okay, then there's the Georgia RICO case. 18 other people are indicted, including Rudy Giuliani, who, funny enough, used the RICO on a lot of mob guys.
He did. I defended a lot of those cases. I was involved on the other side of those cases.
Right. So it's actually kind of funny that he's being hit with a RICO himself. This is a 41-count indictment. And you said this indictment itself is very, very weak when you use RICO and conspiracy.
Right.
You're stretching and pushing and pulling. Right. So this particular case, you think is a weak case?
I think it's a weak case. First of all, it starts with a blatant lie. The prosecutor gets on television, looks the American public in the eye around midnight, and says, I'm going to try to bring this trial in 6 months. She was lying through her teeth. She knew full well she could never bring this trial to fruition within 6 months. It was a deliberate, willful, calculated, malicious lie. It's a heck of a way to start a case where you're trying to convict somebody of lying by yourself lying. There's just no excuse for that. This trial will not be taking place within 6 months. When you have 19 defendants, 50 lawyers, 95-page indictment, hundreds of thousands of pages of documentation. If this case comes to trial within a year, it will be a miracle. She has a case right now in her county in which they're still picking jurors. It's going to take weeks to pick jurors in this case. She was just lying. And, as Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, when you're dealing with the government, it's expected that you will turn square corners. And Justice Gorsuch then said, and when the government deals with you, it's expected they will turn square corners. She was turning a sharp corner, not a square corner, lying to the public. And I have no faith in her ability to give these 19 defendants a fair trial.
Well, we talk about smoking guns. Now, the phone call that Trump made to Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger.
Right.
You don't think that was somewhat of a smoking gun when Trump said on that phone call he needs to find 11,780 votes?
I think it was a smoking gun of innocence. If I'm the defense attorney, I start the case with that tape. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, listen to what Donald Trump actually said. He said, I need to find then the number of votes to win. He didn't say make up, invent, concoct. He said find. Find has a dictionary meaning. It means they're there. They're there to be found. I can tell you, I was a lawyer in the Bush versus Gore litigation. I represented the voters of Palm Beach County on the butterfly ballot. Do you know how many times Gore lawyers said, we got to find 600 votes? We got to find 600 votes. They're there. We got to find them. That's the most exculpatory piece of evidence there is. So yeah, a smoking gun, but a smoking gun of innocence, not a smoking gun of guilt.
Well, the RICO case in Georgia is a state case, not a federal case. So if by chance Trump becomes president again, he won't be able to stop this.
That's right. That's right. I don't think he's really going to be able to stop even the federal cases. There are all kinds of questions about whether a president can pardon himself, whether a president can call off a case against himself. There were some discussions of that in the framing of the Constitution. There's no definitive answer to that, but boy, he would have to pay a very high political price if he did that. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think he's going to be elected. The only way he gets elected, I believe, is if there's a strong third-party candidate who takes votes away from the Democrat, much the way Ralph Nader took votes away from, I believe, from Al Gore in Florida. I think if Ralph Nader hadn't run, George Bush would have been defeated and Al Gore would have been the president. That could happen here, but absent the third party, I don't see how Trump gets above the 45-46% numbers. You don't have to get much higher than that with the Electoral College. After all, he won in 2016 with a minority of votes, as George Bush won in 2000 with a minority of votes, but I just don't think it's going to happen. But I'm not a political expert, so I'm not going to count on that. My predictions about the law have all turned out to be correct. My predictions on the 4 indictments were correct. My prediction on the fact that the judge would not accept the Hunter Biden plea bargain was correct. And in my book, Get Trump, I make a series of predictions about what would happen. This book was published a couple of months ago, and every one of the predictions I made in this book has turned out true. It's not because I'm smarter than the CNN people. The CNN predictions are all wrong all the time. Why? Because CNN experts are engaging in wishful thinking and self-fulfilling prophecies. They're not basing their predictions on any experience. Most of them don't have any experience or any valid experience. They're basing it on what they want to happen. I'm not any smarter. I'm just more honest. And that is, I base my predictions not on what I want to happen, but what I believe will happen based on my 60 years of experience. That's why they've turned out to be true. That's why Mark Levin called me the Nostradamus of the legal profession, because my predictions have turned out to be accurate.
Well, if Trump does get convicted of one of these crimes, like, for example, the RICO case in Georgia has a 5-year minimum, and he has to actually go to a real prison, how would that work with Secret Service and everything else like that?
Well, it doesn't matter whether he's president or not. He still gets Secret Service protection, even if he's a former president. So if he's a former president, the Secret Service would basically have to move to an office or a room next to his cell. They would have to keep eyes on him. If he's president, obviously, he would not be able to serve. The courts would hold that he has the right to delay his service of sentence until after his term of office is over. I don't think that's going to happen, but it's within the realm of possibility.
Okay, well, I mean, we'll see what happens at this point. I mean, it's still very early in the process, and these cases do take a very long time to fulfill. So,
well, they take a long time
cases,
if you want them to take a long time. If the government wants to get a conviction before the election, generally they can bring that about. They can't try the case in Georgia within 6 months. That's just a blatant lie. But they can probably try it within 10 months or a year. That still is before the election. The New York case could be tried relatively quickly. It's a simple-minded case. The Florida case can be tried quickly. The one case that can't be tried quickly, the Georgia case, is the one where the prosecutor lied to us and said, I can get this case, or I'll try to get this case within 6 months. Now, I want people to play back that recording when 8 months, 10 months, 12 months go by and she hasn't brought it to trial, and then ask her, why did you lie to the American public? She's not going to be able to answer that.
Well, if he gets convicted before the election, can he still run for president? Because
Yes.
What's the precedent for this?
Well, here's what his opponents, the reason I entitled my book Get Trump, is the goal is to prevent him from running for office. Now, the theory behind the Washington prosecution and the Georgia prosecution is that if he's convicted, they will argue that he's been convicted of sedition, rebellion, etc. And under the 14th Amendment, he can't run. 14th Amendment is very unclear about that. I don't believe it applies to cases after the Civil War, but there are some scholars who think it does. And so there'll be litigation about that. But in the end, I think he will run, even if he's convicted.
Okay, so even if he's convicted, he'll still be running for president.
I think that's right.
Wow. Okay.
Remember that Eugene V. Debs ran for president, I think it was 1920. I may have my year off, maybe off by a year or two. But I think it was 1920. He ran while he was in prison. Eugene V. Debs, the socialist candidate. And I think the mayor of Boston ran when he was in prison. So, there have been a lot of flawed elections. People forget that. Not necessarily presidential elections, but congressmen, governors, mayors have gone to jail for fraudulent elections, and some elections have been reversed. So it would not be incredibly unusual if they were to have found flaws in this election. My own view is that this is an election on balance was fair.
Okay, so let's go ahead and go into your story. So you were born in 1938, and you grew up in Borough Park, Brooklyn.
Yeah, I was born in Williamsburg, which my grandparents moved to from the Lower East Side shortly after they built the Williamsburg Bridge connecting the Lower East Side to Williamsburg. My grandfathers both helped found yeshivot, which are Jewish elementary and high schools, and also a synagogue. So they were very active. My grandfather helped rescue 28 members of our family from the Holocaust at the very last moment. They were poor. My family was very poor, but they were active. And I'm very proud of my grandfather and the role he played in saving these people from the Holocaust.
Yeah, I actually lived in Borough Park for about a year.
Where? What street did you live on?
I actually tried to find the street this morning. I couldn't figure
it out.
Well,
I lived on 16th Avenue and 48th Street. There was a great candy store on the corner, which sold me my Superman comics. And the great ambition I had was to be able to afford Mounds bars. They were 10 cents, whereas the other candies were 5 cents, and I was never able to afford the Mounds bars. That's why Mounds are now my favorite candy, because it's a part of nostalgia. And, I grew up in Brooklyn as a fervent Brooklyn Dodger fan. I almost gave up my faith in God when, just around the time of Yom Kippur, Bobby Thompson hit that famous home run, the shot heard around the world, to beat the Dodgers after the Dodgers were 8 games ahead of the Giants in August. So that was a devastating time of my life, as was when the Brooklyn Dodgers, after finally winning the World Series, moved to Los Angeles. I still can't get over that one.
Yeah, when I lived there, it was all Hasidic Jewish everywhere.
There were
right across the street from a big synagogue. Everything was shut down on Saturdays. I was a bit of an alien walking around that community.
Well, I was an alien going back there recently, even wearing a kippah, because I didn't wear my, uniform, and I don't have payas and a beard. So when I grew up in Borough Park, it was modern Orthodox. I would say the community was divided probably 60% modern Orthodox or conservative Jews, almost no Hasidim, probably about 30% Italian Americans, almost all from Sicily or from southern Italy, and the remainder, an assortment of Irish, Puerto Rican, and other ethnicities. And we all got along great. I mean, occasionally it'd be a pushing and shoving match. Hey, you looked at my girlfriend the wrong way. But it would not be. Nobody had knives or guns, and we didn't lock our doors. Nobody had cars. I got my first car when I was in college. I bought a used a Dodge, and I used it to drive my friends to school. But it was a poor but not poverty-stricken neighborhood. Most people who lived there, their parents, their fathers, because fathers were only, my mother was unusual. She worked, but mostly fathers worked, and mostly they were working people, made a salary, and the salaries were, less than $10,000 a year. Nobody was starving, but nobody had luxuries. I never bought a toy in my life, even for Hanukkah. Rarely did I get a new toy. I got a hand-me-down from somebody in the family.
Okay, so you graduate high school, you go to Brooklyn
Barely
College.
graduate high school. I have my transcript here. I think I was like, I don't know, 39th out of a class of 47. So I had 8 people worse than me, but 39 better than me. I was a really bad student in high school. I won my first case in high school. My principal didn't allow me to take the state scholarship exam because my grades were too low, and we brought a challenge, and I got to take the state scholarship exam and win one. And then I barely made it into Brooklyn College with the skin of my teeth, and then finished the top of my class at Brooklyn College. Out of 2,500 people, quite a difference from high school and college for me.
Right. And then you went to Yale Law School.
I went to Yale Law School off the waiting list. They predicted I would have a C average, which in those days was a gentleman's C. That was okay. I ended up with an A average and first in my class and editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal. So I was a late bloomer, and the predictions about me were not particularly accurate.
Okay, so after you graduated from law school, a couple years later, you ended up being a clerk for a Supreme Court judge.
That's right.
For Goldberg.
That's right.
Justice Arthur Goldberg. And you said that was a big turning point in your life.
Being a law clerk on the Supreme Court was a big turning point. It made it clear that I could become a professor and I would be able to practice law at the elite part of the firm. Goldberg was a great justice to clerk for. I had previously clerked for Judge David Bazelon, who was the chief judge of the Court of Appeals. Both were Jewish liberal judges. And for me, that was important because I wanted to be a liberal. I was also offered a clerkship from Justice Hugo Black, but he was nearing the end of his career, and Goldberg was just beginning his career. And so I preferred to work for a new justice. And I clerked probably during the most liberal year in Supreme Court history, the 1963-1964 term, which saw some of the most liberal decisions in American history.
I mean, when you see what's happening with Supreme Court these days, for example, the whole Clarence Thomas fiasco of all the gifts that he took over the years,
right?
Do you think there's going to be some sort of change in the Supreme Court, or is it going to be business as usual?
There has to be a change. There has to be a rules of ethics. Let me tell you a story about Goldberg. One day, I came into work early every day, and there was a basket of fruit, and with a note on it from the publisher of the Washington Post. Dear Arthur, they were good friends. Dear Arthur, happy birthday, I think it was, or something like that. Please enjoy the fruit. And there it was, filled with fruit. I was there in the morning. I was hungry. I took a banana and I ate the banana. It was my breakfast. Goldberg walks in about an hour later and says, Alan, what's that? And I said, it's a basket of fruit from the owner of the Washington Post. And he said, well, send that back to her immediately. We have a case pending in the court about the Pentagon Papers. No, it wasn't the Pentagon Papers. It was New York Times versus Sullivan. I'm sorry. New York Times versus Sullivan. We have a case pending. Send it back to her immediately. And I said, Mr. Justice, I have to admit I ate a banana. He said, well, you go to the store right now, you buy a banana, you put it back in the basket, then you take it back to her and say, well, thank you so much, but I can't accept a gift from you. That was the ethics that I was brought up with. Certainly very different than Clarence Thomas or some of the other justices over time. Abe Fortas left the court because of ethical violations. So I think we need a very clear set of ethical rules that govern the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is certainly entitled to create those rules.
Okay, so in 1964, you became an assistant professor at Harvard, and then in 67, you were made a full professor at age 28, which at the time you were the youngest full professor in the history of law school at Harvard.
I think it's still true. I don't think there's been anybody younger than me ever since. I'm now perhaps one of the oldest. Emeritus, I taught for 50 straight years. I taught over 10,000 students, and I was a good teacher, and I loved teaching.
Okay, and your first case, the first big case you had was in 76 with Harry Reams, who was actually charged with obscenity for actually acting in the adult film Deep Throat, right?
It was more than an adult film. It was a horrible pornographic film with terrible actors, terrible photography. I have to tell you, I have not seen the whole film. I decided never to see it when I argued the case. And I think about, I don't remember, 10 years ago or so, at the whatever anniversary it was of the Deep Throat case, there was an event in New York at a theater, and I was debating Catherine McKinnon. And so they showed parts of the movie just to give a sense of what they didn't show the pornographic parts. And those are the only parts of the movie I've ever seen. I've never actually seen the entire film, Deep Throat, because I don't believe that these cases are about the content of the film. It's about the right either to see or not to see. When I had a case where they showed Deep Throat at Harvard, I said to the judge, Your Honor, I'm going to walk out when this movie is shown. I'm going to demonstrate clearly that this is about my right to choose to see it, or my right to choose not to see it. Unfortunately, many rabid feminists who love the right to choose when it comes to abortion don't believe in the right to choose when it comes to obscenity or pornography. If they don't like the film, they don't want you to see it. And I strongly oppose that point of view.
Okay, then 1984, you had your high-profile case with Klaus von Bülow. Did I pronounce it right?
Yep.
Okay, this is someone who was basically accused of killing his wife?
Trying to kill his wife.
Trying to kill his wife. Got it.
If he tried to, he failed. She remained alive and in a coma for another decade or so.
And then in 1986, he got involved in Nelson Mandela's case.
That's right. What happened was this. I was defending Soviet dissidents. In 1974, I went to the Soviet Union for the first time at the request of Elie Wiesel, a dear friend. And I defended, along with Telford Taylor and a group of other people, many of the most prominent Jewish dissidents, including Anatoly Sharansky, including two who were sentenced to death. And then we tried some years later to arrange a spy swap, which succeeded. And we got Sharansky out of prison. But we were also trying to get Nelson Mandela out of prison. I was working with the African National Congress, the ANC, in an effort to try to include Mandela in the swap. And the South African government agreed, as did the Russian government, but Nelson Mandela refused. He said, I'm not a spy. I'm not going to leave under these circumstances. I'm going to wait until the government of South Africa acknowledges they made a mistake and free me, and I will walk out bravely as a free man. And that's what he did. To his credit, he spent an additional couple of years in Robben Island because he wanted to leave on his terms, and he did. And I was proud to have played a small role in that case.
Well, yeah, he was freed in 1990 after serving 27 years. And then he became the president of South Africa. And I think what was interesting about his presidency was that I think he announced at the beginning that this is not going to be a revenge for white people in South Africa. They're not going to try to punish them and so forth. We have to try to all live together.
Well, I hope that that's true. There's a leading politician today in South Africa who has led cheers calling on the killing of the Boers. And by Boers, I don't mean people who are boring or the animal Boers. I mean, he was advocating the killing of white farmers. And he's now a leading politician in South Africa, and he should be condemned. He violates the spirit of Nelson Mandela, and yet he has emerged as a leading political force. I hope he's defeated in the marketplace of ideas.
Well, then 1992 rolls around. You had a couple of big cases then. Leona Helmsley, a.k.a. the Queen of Mean, who was a billionaire who was convicted of tax evasion and also not paying a bunch of people and so forth. She originally had 16 years for tax evasion, and you reduced that to essentially 21 months. Now, she was a very hated person. I remember this. Like the whole world hated her at this time.
And they were right. Like this? And they were right. She was not a nice person. I can tell you just one story. I was having breakfast with her in a hotel, and the tea that I had ordered came, and there was some liquid in the saucer, and she threw the saucer in the cup against the granite floor, and it broke into dozens of pieces. And she then said to the young waiter, "Now get on your knees and beg me for my job." And I walked out and I said, "I'll never be with you again. except in court. I didn't like her. I didn't like many of my clients, but you have to defend them. Look, Donald Trump, I didn't vote for him. I voted against him twice. I intend to vote against him a third time. It's all about the law for me. It's all about the Constitution. It's all about civil liberties. It's not about personalities.
Well, that same year, you represented Mia Farrow. I think I'm
Mia
mispronouncing her
Farrow.
name.
Mia Farrow in her case against Woody Allen. Yeah.
Mia Farrow, sorry.
Farrow.
Now, number one, based on what you know about the case, do you think that Woody Allen sexually abused his daughter, or do you think that the whole thing was made up as a money grab?
Well, I don't think he did. But I think that it's possible that people on Mayor Farrow's side believe he did. But if you ask me, my personal opinion, I do not think he did.
Okay, but you're representing her.
I did, but I don't have to agree with everything that a person says. I represented her in a custody lawsuit, and we prevailed. We won. But that doesn't mean that I have to believe every allegation that she's made. I don't believe that one personally.
Well, there was an allegation that you and her legal team asked Woody Allen for a lump sum payment of $7 million or maybe even $5 million to make this whole thing go away. Is that true?
Well, we negotiated. I can't get into the specifics, but in all these cases, you negotiate. And we negotiated for a lump sum payment that would pay for all the expenses and everything. And obviously, the record shows that it was turned down and it went to court. But negotiations are extremely common in these kinds of custody cases.
And then that next year, in 1993, you represented Mike Tyson. Now, at the time, Mike Tyson was already convicted, so this was an appeal case.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, you've said in interviews that Mike Tyson is absolutely innocent.
Absolutely.
Now, I've interviewed Mike before, and we've talked about this whole situation. He talked about his jail time and everything else like that. Why would you say he's absolutely innocent?
Because I've seen the evidence. I've seen the evidence of 4 witnesses who were kept out of the case. I've seen the evidence of medical tests. I've seen all the evidence, and the evidence just points inerringly to his innocence. So I believe he was innocent.
Okay, and you said that there's 4 witnesses who I guess saw Tyson and his accuser like kiss and cuddle with each other before the actual incident.
Yeah.
And why was this left out of the actual courtroom?
Because the judge was a prosecutor. She had previously been a rape prosecutor. She was totally and completely biased, and she just didn't want to admit evidence that would have led the jury to acquit, which I think the jury would have done. And the case was fixed in some ways. The case was ultimately, only did the appeal, and the appeal was decided 2-2. 2 votes to reverse, 2 votes to affirm. Or 2 votes to take the case, 2 votes not to take the case. But if they had taken it, they would have reversed. Because the chief judge, who himself had been accused of sexual misconduct, disqualified himself from the case based on a setup. What happened is I was at my Yale Law School reunion talking to my dear friend Stephen Trachtenberg, and this woman came over and started tapping me on the back. And I said, "Excuse me, ma'am, I'm in a conversation." She said, No, this is important. You can't expect that New York logic will win in Indiana. I said, "Well, ma'am, who are you?" She said, "Well, I'm the wife of the Chief Justice." And I said, "I'm sorry, I can't talk to you." The Chief Justice, in my view, sent her to talk to me and then made up a story that, we had discussed the case. We hadn't discussed the case. And then the chief judge disqualified himself from the case, leading to the 2-2 verdict. It was one of the worst miscarriages of justice that I've seen in my 60 years.
Well, I guess Mike Tyson actually ran out of money.
I continued to defend him without money. I continued to defend him. He paid me some money, and then he couldn't pay. But I have to tell you about Mike. The day he fought his first fight after he left prison, he paid me and all the other lawyers, even some who didn't continue with him. I continued with him because I never drop a case. Because my client runs out of money, I feel that I have an ethical obligation to continue the case as long as the client can't afford it. If the client refuses to pay, that's one thing. But if he can't afford it, I continue on the case. I've done that in numerous cases.
Any interesting stories while dealing with Mike during this time?
Yeah, I mean, when I met Mike, the night he was about to go into prison, first time, he says to me, "You think I'm innocent?" I said, "I don't know. I wasn't there. I haven't yet read the whole transcript." He said, "Well, all right. What kind of a guy you think I am?" I said, "Mike, please excuse me, but I think you're a schmuck." He said, "You calling me a schmuck?" I said, "Yeah, going up to a hotel room at 3 a.m. with a woman you didn't know, without anybody being there as a witness, that's something a schmuck does." And he turned to his handlers and said, "This guy, Alan, he called me a schmuck. I wish you had called me a schmuck and told me I shouldn't do it. You're hired." So that's how I became his lawyer. And I consider myself now somebody who has high respect for him. He's turned his life around. He's done some very good things.
Okay. And then in 1995, the trial of O.J. Simpson. How did you get involved in this case?
I was in Israel with my son at some event, and I had been on television before I went to Israel, the day after the killing. And I said, of course he's guilty. I mean, it's always the husband, and he has a history of abuse. So I think he'll probably plead guilty and come up with some excuse to minimize the sentence. Well, he didn't do that. But when I was in Israel, I got a call from Bob Shapiro saying, "We need you to become our, appellate advisor in the case." And I said, "I can't do it. I've already said he's guilty." And Bob said, "Well, everybody thinks he's guilty. But we need you to save him from the death penalty because they're seeking the death penalty." So I agreed to take the case.
Okay. And how involved were you in this case?
I was pretty involved. I mean, I wasn't there. I wasn't at the trial except maybe a dozen days. I was watching it on a closed circuit television with my legal team in my office in Cambridge, and we were turning out briefs and sending them by fax as the case was ongoing. I was the God forbid lawyer, the lawyer that he would have to use, God forbid, if he were convicted. But he wasn't convicted, and so I never had to argue the appeal.
Okay, so did you deal with him directly at all, or just through
Oh,
his
of course. No, I was with him. I was with him when the glove was tried on. I was with him before the glove was tried on. Right after there was a break, I was with him again. We talked about whether they wanted to try on the glove again without the latex underglove. So, yeah, no, I got to know him pretty well.
Well, you said that we didn't win the case, they lost it. They blew it. They made the worst possible mistakes. And you talked about the whole glove situation because I guess they could have had him try on the glove in a private room without the jury, right?
That's right. And they didn't do it. They were so arrogant and self-confident. They didn't do it. They made every possible mistake in the book. I wrote a book about it called Reasonable Doubts, which I used to give out to my students and say, if you want to be a criminal lawyer, read this book and don't do what the prosecutors did in this case. They made every mistake in the book, starting from where the trial was held, downtown Los Angeles, which would have a very positive jury pool for us, instead of in Brentwood, which would have had a less good jury pool. How the jury was selected, everything was wrong. Marcia Clark and Darden were the worst possible prosecutors to try this case, and it showed. So we didn't win, they lost.
Well, yeah, you said that they made fools of themselves in front of the jury. They put on police officers they could prove that were lying. We caught them tampering with evidence, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of your dealings with OJ, any interesting stories around what happened, out of the cameras?
No, I never saw him except in prison. Remember, by the time I got in the case, bail had been denied and he was in prison. So I went to visit him in jail. And so there aren't too many interesting stories, except, he maintained himself in really good shape while he was on trial. He was a funny guy. And he took control of the defense. He knew what he wanted. And he instructed Johnny Cochran and Bob Shapiro and F. Lee Bailey. The decisions were largely his, except the decision to testify. He wanted to testify. And all of us except Lee Bailey told him not to.
Well, I remember the documentary about the case. They were saying that he was on some sort of medication, and if he didn't take it, his hands would somewhat swell. And they were saying that was the reason why the glove didn't fit. I mean, from your point of view, do you think that was actually his glove, or was it planted, or
I have
what
no
happened?
idea. I have no idea. The point is not what I believe. The point is what the jury believed. And the jury believed that evidence had been tampered with, and that was a reasonable belief. And the judge correctly instructed that you had to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. And remember, the jury consisted of 9 African Americans, but 3 non-African Americans, including a white woman who had previously turned the jury around, that had preliminarily voted for conviction, for acquittal, and she made them vote for conviction. We called her the demon because we were afraid that she would always vote for conviction, but she didn't. She then regretted it afterward and said she wished she had voted for conviction, but she didn't.
I mean, were you surprised when you heard the non-guilty verdict?
I did. I was surprised. I thought there might be a hung jury. I didn't think there'd be an acquittal.
Okay. Based on what you know, do you think he was guilty or not guilty?
I can't tell you that. I can tell you that Benjamin Netanyahu once asked me that question. And I said, Mr. Prime Minister, does Israel have nuclear weapons? And he said, Alan, I can't tell you that. I said, Mr. Prime Minister, I can't tell you that. We both have secrets.
Okay. So in 2002, after the September 11 attacks, you wrote an article in the San Francisco Chronicle that basically advocated torture for certain situations when it comes to terrorism.
No, I didn't.
No?
No. What I said was this: torture would occur. Torture has occurred. Torture is occurring. What we need, if we're going to torture, we need torture warrants. We need some degree of control by the courts. I don't advocate torture, but I know as a practical matter, if we could torture somebody and prevent a mass casualty attack, every president would authorize it. Every governor, every mayor would authorize it. And if it's going to happen, there should be torture warrants. So I advocate the use of a torture warrant. I do not advocate the use of torture. And that's a subtle distinction that many people did not understand and still do not understand. So I've been called the Torquemada of law professors on the ground that I advocate torture. I don't advocate torture. I'm opposed to torture.
Well, right, because, I mean, the situation you brought up in this was that if there's a ticking time bomb and if you could torture someone to stop it, then you should do it. But this whole situation is somewhat imaginary because you would have to know that this person knows about the time bomb and knows how to stop it before you actually start torturing him, which is sort of an impossible situation.
Well, it's not. Let me tell you a real story that happened. So there was a guy who was planning to blow up 9 commercial airliners from the Pacific to the United States. And he was part of a group that was planning to do this. And he was captured in the Philippines. And they tortured him, as they do in the Philippines. And he not only disclosed the plot, but he took them to where the bombs were. And he took them to the costume he was going to use to get access to the airplanes. So that was a case where a mass killing, 9 planes with 300 people, it's, almost 3,000 people, lives were saved because of torture. So it's a real situation. It's very rare, extremely rare, which is why you should have to get a warrant, because the warrant should almost never be granted. But if you get a case like that, a genuine, actual ticking bomb case, and I'm told by people who know in Israel that they have prevented some terrorist attacks by the use of, they don't call it torture, by the use of enhanced interrogation, but I call it torture.
Okay. Do you ever expect Israel and Palestine to ever be at peace? My entire life as a Jewish person, and I've been to Israel multiple times, it's really upsetting. It's really frustrating in terms of what's happening over there.
I agree with you.
I can understand both sides of the story, I really wish that at some point it could be worked out. But you know way more than I do about the situation. You know Netanyahu personally. I do not.
I do.
Do you ever expect in a foreseeable future for there to be peace there?
I think it's not likely. Why? Because the Palestinians were offered a state in 1937, 1938. They were offered a state in 1945, 1947, 1948. They were offered a state in 1967. They were offered a state in 1990. They were offered a state, a very large state in 2000, 2001, an even larger state in 2008. And every time they turned it down. And now it's become harder and harder and harder, because the Israeli government has turned more conservative. There are more settlers in the West Bank. So it's not become easier. It was very easy in 38. It was very easy in 48. It was very easy in 67. It was very easy in 90, in 2000, 2001, and 2008. It's much harder now, but it's all, not some, all the Palestinian leadership fault. They have turned down repeatedly opportunities to have a two-state solution because they will not say the following words: we recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. How do I know they won't say those words? I asked Abbas personally. I know him, and we had dinner together, and I asked him that question. No, he wouldn't do it.
I mean, does it really come down to the old city of Jerusalem, though? And really that being such a sacred place to both religions that neither party really wants to give it away?
The vast majority of Israelis are secular, and they care more about Tel Aviv than they do about Jerusalem. And they care more about watching their soccer games than they do about who's praying in the mountain, the hill of the mountain. So the religious part of it is important, and it's become increasingly important with the increasing power of the Haredi Jews. But the issue was never really about Jerusalem. It was always about Tel Aviv, Haifa, and the other areas. Remember, in each of the peace plans that Israel accepted, Jerusalem was divided into West Jerusalem and East Jerusalem, and the Israelis were willing to accept that. Palestinians were not.
Well, when did you first get to know Jeffrey Epstein?
I think it was on Martha's Vineyard. A woman named trying to remember her name, Lynn Forrester, who then became married to one of the Rothschilds, Evelyn de Rothschild. She begged me to see Jeffrey Epstein. He was coming to the Vineyard. I never heard of him. She said he's a major contributor to Harvard. He just wants an hour with you to have some intellectual talk. Finally, I said yes. He brought a bottle of wine, which he didn't drink because he never drank wine. And we took a walk for 1 hour. And that was, I think, probably was toward the end of the 20th century. It was 1996, 1997. So I met him. Then he invited us, Carolyn, me, and my daughter. We were in the Caribbean on vacation. He said he had just bought an island, so he invited us. He sent the little private plane with one pilot, an old man. We were nervous about it, and just a propeller plane to fly from, I don't remember, Martinique or St. Martin or Guadeloupe, one of those islands. And we flew and we went to his island. We had spent 1 day there. There was nobody on the island. There were no young people. There were just some people who were building. The island was mostly barren. He also invited Professor Porter, a distinguished professor at Harvard Business School, to have dinner with us. We had dinner and then we left. That was the end. I never was on the island again. I was never on Lolita Island, or was never on his plane flying to the island. I knew him academically and went to his seminars. And then I was his lawyer. Of course, I never, ever, under any circumstances, had sex with anybody ever connected to Jeffrey Epstein, period. And then the woman who accused me has now admitted, after 8 years, admitted that she may have mistook me for somebody else. It may have been a case of mistaken identification, and she dropped all of her allegations against me.
Let's talk about that case. So in 2008, he was arrested. He was charged with 4 counts of unlawful sex with minors and 1 count of sexual abuse. Now, how did you actually get on this case as his lawyer?
Well, he just asked me. What happened was I knew him. So this was a few years after I knew him. And he said he just was being investigated. Would I defend him? I was reluctant at the beginning because I knew him. He said, I just want you to help me put together the legal team and do some negotiation. I'm not a trial lawyer generally. And so I did that. And I put together a legal team that consisted of some of the best lawyers in Florida. They did most of the negotiation. I was there. But we negotiated what I thought was a pretty good deal. Epstein didn't think it was a good deal. He thought we had sold him out. In fact, he fired me and wouldn't pay my fee initially because he thought we could have gotten a better deal. So, that's the way it is with lawyers and clients. Once he was pled guilty, once I found out what he was alleged to have done, did my own investigation, I never again had a social relationship with him.
Okay. So in terms of the actual case itself, some of your critics have said that you actually had a scorched earth attack of the girls that were the alleged victims. Would you agree with that or no?
I did exactly what I do in every other case. any witness against my client, we're going to look up everything on their Facebooks. We're going to look up everything in their background, and we're going to question them about it. It never came to trial, so there was no scorched earth, but we would have obviously cross-examined them and very vigorously. That's what you do. If you don't do that, you're not doing your job.
Okay. And as you're going through the actual case, did you feel that Epstein was guilty or no?
I told you, I can't ever tell you whether I think my clients are guilty. He pleaded guilty to one count of underage and one count of above age. And he got a sentence for that. He did not plead guilty and was never put on trial for all these massive allegations. He might have been had he not committed suicide, but he did.
Right. So he got 18 months in prison for the case that you worked on.
Right.
And a lot of people were really upset over this.
Well, that's too bad. I mean, they should complain to the judge. They should complain to the prosecutor. But the one person you can't complain to is the defense attorney. The defense attorney tries to get the best deal you possibly can. And I've been pretty good at that and getting good deals, and I'll continue to do that. I'm not the judge. I don't decide. I just advocate.
Okay. And you just said yourself that after going through your own investigation and what you found, you did not want to represent him after that.
Oh, no, I didn't want to have social contact with him after that.
Social contact. Yeah. Got it. Well, then on July 6, 2019, he was arrested by the FBI and the NYPD Crimes Against Children Task Force. When they went through his townhouse, they found evidence of sex trafficking. They found hundreds, if not thousands, of sexually suggestive photographs of either nude or partially nude females. And some of these pictures were actually matched to underage girls. He also had a fraudulent passport from Austria that showed that he had moved around the world under a fake name. He was charged with sex trafficking, conspiracy to traffic minors for sex, and he was denied bail. When he was arrested for this, what did you think? Since you were not his lawyer at this point.
I was not his lawyer. He didn't call me. I never spoke to him once he was arrested. I was surprised at the extent of all of his wrongdoing, but I had nothing to do with him at that point and nothing to do with this case.
Okay, so he had requested a bond, $100 million bond, but it was actually denied by the judge because they felt he was a flight risk. And then on August 10, 2019, they found him hanging in his jail cell. Now, this created a flurry of conspiracy theories. Based on what you know, do you think that he killed himself, or do you think that someone had him killed because he knew too much?
The theory that he was killed because he knew too much is silly, because nobody would believe anything he said. He had no credibility at all. And so there'd be no benefit to killing him. I think he killed himself with the help of prison guards. I think he paid off prison guards to turn off the cameras, to turn their backs. I don't think he could have committed suicide by himself, but I do think he decided he could not spend the rest of his life in rat-infested jail cells, and that it would be easier for him to end it than to just spend the rest of his life suffering in prison. That was his decision, and he acted on it, but I think with the help of other people.
Well, and then his accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell, she got 20 years in prison. What do you think about that?
I think it's outrageous. I think what she did was basically act as a secretary. She didn't deserve anything like 20 years in prison. And I think she basically got the sentence he would have gotten if he remained alive. She became the scapegoat.
Did you know her personally?
Yeah, I do. Sure. I met her when I met Jeffrey Epstein. When the only time we were on the island, my wife and my daughter and Professor Porter, she was the other person at dinner. We assumed that she was Epstein's girlfriend. And so, we had dinner with her, and I've met her on a couple of other occasions before all of this happened.
Right. And then one of the victims in the case, she actually listed you as, along with Prince Andrew, as one of the people that he had given underage girls to for sex.
Well, first of all,
you actually sued her.
First of all, she wasn't underage. She was well over age. Second, she also accused George Mitchell, the former majority leader of the Senate. She accused Ambassador Bill Richardson. She accused Prime Minister Ehud Barak. She accused Jacques Cousteau's granddaughter. She had an incredibly long list of famous people that she accused, but I was the only one who sued her. And because I had nothing to hide, nothing to lose, I've never had sex with anybody improperly in my life. Whereas I'm sure some of the other people, Prince Andrew was known as Randy Andy, whether justifiably or not. But he had a history and a background. I was, happily married during the entire relevant period of time. And from the day I met Jeffrey Epstein till the day he died, I never had sex, obviously, with anybody other than my wife. I don't even hug. So I had nothing to lose by suing, and I did. A lot to lose. I lost a lot of legal fees, and it was expensive for me. But I wanted to be completely and totally vindicated. And so I brought my lawsuit, and she brought a lawsuit against me.
Right. I think you said you've never actually even seen her or met her.
Oh, I never met her, never saw her, never heard of her. Just out of the blue, completely. Yeah.
Yeah. And ultimately, you won that.
Well, everybody has their own interpretation. There are still people who seem to believe it, and they write me emails all the time, and I have to respond to them because I will not accept silence as an option when I'm falsely accused.
Well, in 2011, you worked as a consultant on Julian Assange, his legal team, who is the founder of WikiLeaks.
Well, more than a consultant. I was actually one of his lawyers. I went to visit him in London before he went to prison. I was pretty actively involved in the case, yeah.
Okay, and you actually feel that what he did wasn't wrong.
I didn't say that. I think what he did wasn't criminal. It's not something I would have done. I think people have a right to make a judgment about him. But I think what he did was protected by the First Amendment in much the same way as what the New York Times and the Washington Post did when they published the Pentagon Papers.
Right. So what exactly is the difference? Because as someone who has a media company, from what I understand, is if someone gives me a set of documents that are not supposed to be released for whatever reason, and I put them out, I can't be charged criminally for doing this as long as I wasn't involved in getting those documents myself, right?
That's generally the rule. I mean, there's no specific case on that. The Supreme Court in the Pentagon Papers case said you couldn't be prevented from publishing it, but they didn't answer the question whether you could be criminally prosecuted. But I think the answer to that is no. If you did nothing wrong and just received the documents and published them, I think the law today is that you are protected by the First Amendment.
Let's fast forward a little bit. You actually identify as a Democrat.
That's right.
And you've supported Hillary Clinton when she was running.
That's right.
Which means that in 2016, you campaigned against Donald Trump.
I did very actively, and I contributed against Donald Trump. I contributed, from my point of view, significantly to Hillary Clinton's campaign, and then I voted against Donald Trump when he ran against Biden, and I plan to vote against him if he runs again against Biden.
Okay, now in terms of your support of Trump, that started around 2018 during the whole Mueller investigation.
I never supported him. I supported his constitutional rights.
Okay, so explain that.
Well, I never supported O.J. Simpson. I never supported Julian Assange. I never supported Harry Reams. What I supported is the Constitution and their constitutional rights. When you're a lawyer, it's no different than a doctor. When a doctor treats a patient, he doesn't support them. He just treats the patient, treats the illness, and then they go about their business. I feel the same way when I'm a lawyer. I don't support him as a candidate or as a person. I only support his legal rights. That's what I did.
Well, right. Well, you said that the Mueller investigation is dangerous for our entire system.
It was, yeah.
How's that?
Well, I think it was a form of McCarthyism. They knew what they wanted, they knew who they wanted, and they looked hard to try to find some justification for going after him. It was Lavrenti Beria, the head of the notorious KGB, who once said to Stalin, show me the man and I'll find you the crime. And I think the Get Trump, and that's why I entitled my book, Get Trump, the Get Trump posse set out to get Trump. And then they said, let's try to figure out ways of getting him. Let's find out how we can get him. And Justice Jackson, one of the greatest justices in history, who had been a former prosecutor, former attorney general, said almost any prosecutor can rummage through the books and find something to investigate a political enemy for. So I'm very much opposed to that.
Okay, so we fast forward to January 6, 2020. Now, according to the January 6th committee, this is what happened. Like I said, this is according to the committee. and people have their own view on this. But it was a 7-part plan to overthrow the 2020 election. Number one, Trump had knowledge that he lost the 2020 election, but spread misinformation to the American public and made false statements claiming significant voter fraud led to his defeat.
Well, that will be obviously determined by a jury, whether he himself knew that. I think a jury will probably find that there's no evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that he actually believed he had lost. I think a jury will probably find that there's a reasonable doubt about that, and that he probably did believe he had won the election because he talked himself into it. Yeah.
Okay, number two. Trump planned to remove and replace the Attorney General and Justice Department officials in an effort to force the DOJ to support false allegations of election fraud.
That seems correct. Yeah.
Okay. Number three, Trump pressured Vice President Pence to refuse certified electoral votes in the official count on January 6th in violation of the U.S. Constitution.
That seems correct. Yeah.
Okay. Number four, Trump pressured state lawmakers and election officials to alter election results in his favor.
Well, not alter. No, I think that he tried to pressure state officials to conduct recounts that might change the vote. I don't think there's any evidence that he pressured anybody to alter any votes, to defraud, to engage in any kind of forgery or fraud. But he did want them to have a recount and alter the results. Yeah, that's true.
Number five, Trump's legal team and associates directed Republicans in 7 states to produce and send fake alternate electoral slates to Congress and the National Archives.
I think that it's true that they tried to get alternate electors, but that's the way you challenge an election. That's the appropriate way to challenge the election. That's the way Jamie Raskin wanted to challenge the 2016 election. It's the way some lawyers for Al Gore wanted to challenge the outcome of the 2000 election. So, yeah, he proposed an alternate slate. The Democrats call that fake electors, just like the Republicans call the news the fake news. It's easy to say fake. It's much harder to prove it.
Okay, number six, Trump summoned and assembled a destructive mob in Washington and sent them to march to the U.S. Capitol. This is the Stop the Steal rally.
Well, he definitely assembled a crowd, and he told them to march to the Capitol peacefully and patriotically to have their voices heard. I fundamentally disagree with what he did and what he said, but I believe it's protected by the First Amendment.
Well, when that crowd got to the Capitol building, they started to actually violently breach the Capitol. They entered the Senate chamber, a bunch of different offices.
Some didn't. I represent one of them, a young law school student who went there peacefully, just went in, did his thing, his protest, and was welcomed in by the police. And then when the police told him to leave, he left. So it was a mixture. There was some violence and some nonviolence, yeah.
Right. Well, as this was happening, the congressional proceedings were suspended. Legislators were taken to secure locations.
Right.
Mike Pence and Nancy Pelosi were evacuated. It was absolute chaos.
Yeah.
Ashley Babbitt was killed by the police trying to enter one of the chambers. 4 police officers were killed, and 4 other officers killed themselves within 7 months of the whole situation. So this was absolute chaos that was happening in the Capitol building.
Yeah.
Now, number 7, which is interesting to me, is that Trump ignored multiple requests to speak out in real time against the mob violence, refused to instruct his supporters to disband, and failed to take any immediate actions to halt attacks on the Capitol.
I think that's true, and I think it's morally wrong, and it's not criminal. It reminds me of some African-American leaders who did not take action to prevent mobs on the West Coast from destroying property and hurting people after the horrible killing of George Floyd. There have been violent demonstrations in the United States, in France, in other parts of the world. That's tragically a part of democracy. You don't have to tolerate the violence, but you have to tolerate the demonstrations. And sometimes peaceful demonstrations that are constitutionally protected are turned into violence, which is not constitutionally protected. But you can't legally, constitutionally, hold the president or anybody else responsible for not stopping it. That was not their legal responsibility to speak out. It was their moral responsibility to do so. One of the reasons I'm not going to vote for Donald Trump is because he failed as a leader in that moral responsibility.
Well, knowing that, you still represented him in his impeachment trial in the Senate.
Well, that happened before. The impeachment trial in the Senate was in January 2000, that is, before the election. So I had nothing to do with any of his cases following his false claim that he had won the election. I condemned that false claim and refused to be involved in any legal case involving the false claim, including his second impeachment.
Aha. Okay, sorry, I'd mixed that up. So you were not involved in anything after January 6th.
Absolutely, and I refused to be because I didn't want to in any way be associated with the false claim that the election had been stolen. It had not been stolen. It was a fair election.
Okay, because you had made a statement saying that if Trump wanted to work with you, that you would do that pro bono and so forth, and you would, if you got any money, you would donate that. So what exactly were you talking about in that case?
Well, I did donate the money that I received for representing him in the first impeachment to charity and pro bono. So I did not keep any of that money.
Got it. Now, you supporting Trump in any way didn't make you very popular in Martha's Vineyard.
Not popular. My God, they not only stopped talking to me, threatened restaurants that they would stop going to the restaurants if the restaurants served me. The library banned my books. The library banned my talks. The community center banned me. The Jewish synagogue, the Hebrew Center banned me. People who I've helped their kids get into college screamed at me, yelled at me, said I was disgusting. People were told that if they were seen talking to me, they would no longer be part of the, quote, social circle. And I was completely canceled. A friend of mine wanted to invite me to a private concert that he had in his house. He said, though, if I invited you, I'd be committing social suicide. A Republican who voted for Donald Trump said to me, I think everything you did was right, but I didn't want to support you because I would be ostracized by the community. So it was just old-fashioned McCarthyism, left-wing McCarthyism.
Well, what happened between you and Larry David?
Well, he was a friend, and I had helped this kid get into college. I had helped him twice on legal cases, and he had come to my house for dinner several times, worked out in my gym. But as soon as I defended Donald Trump, he said I was disgusting and despicable, and he would never again talk to me. That's his loss. I'm a pretty interesting guy to talk to, and if he doesn't want to talk to me, he's going to have to talk to all the boring people in Chilmark who have nothing to say. So that's his choice.
Well, didn't he scream at you at a grocery store?
He did. At the Chilmark, it's not the grocery store, it's the Chilmark General Store, where I used to go for lunch a few times a week with friends. And he passed me by and he started screaming and yelling at me. His veins popped out of his head. And it was as if he saw Heinrich Himmler on his way to helping Adolf Hitler. That's the way his mind worked. He couldn't rationally consider this. It really was an example of Trump derangement syndrome. Previously, I had experienced Israel derangement syndrome. By the way, most of the people who canceled me on the Vineyard are also virulently anti-Israel. They hate Israel, and they hated me because I supported Israel. The 2 or 3 leaders. The leader of the campaign to get me banned in the library was Larry David's former wife, Lori David. She headed the campaign to get me banned from the library. She claims to be a believer in the Constitution. One of my best stories about that is I was seated next to Caroline Kennedy at a dinner party, and she said, if I knew you were coming, I would never have accepted the invitation because you defended Donald Trump. I said, but Caroline, I also defended a guy named Ted Kennedy, your uncle. Would you refuse an invitation because I defended him in a homicide case? Well, she didn't answer. She walked away.
Right, because didn't you give a copy of Curb Your Enthusiasm? There was the whole
I did.
The Palestinian chicken episode
I
to
did.
Netanyahu.
I gave the Palestinian chicken episode to both Abbas when I met him, the head of the Palestinian Authority, and I gave it to Benjamin Netanyahu. And I suggested that all 3 of us watch it together and get a good laugh, but Abbas wouldn't do it. Bibi said he would.
In terms of what's happening in Israel right now with Netanyahu and the whole Supreme Court thing, and I mean, he's been president of Israel most of my life at this point.
Prime Minister.
I mean, do you expect Prime Minister, sorry. Do you expect anything to really change in Israel and Netanyahu? Is there going to be new leadership? Is there going to be actual change in the coming future?
I think there'll be change. Benjamin Netanyahu is the longest serving prime minister in Israel history, longer than David Ben-Gurion, in a country that is famous for its quick turnover of prime ministers. You know, they've had 5 elections in 5 years, something like that. I think he'll last this term, but probably it will be his last term, and then we'll see new leadership. But Israel is a thriving democracy. It will always be a thriving democracy. I oppose most of the judicial reform, but even if all the judicial reform were to be enacted, Israel would still be as democratic as Sweden and Denmark and Canada and Britain and the United States and Australia. So people on both sides are exaggerating what's at stake in this judicial reform. The judicial reform is really a surrogate for the fact that we're seeing a movement increasing the power of the right wing and increasing the power of very ultra-Orthodox Jews. And the secular Jews are understandably upset about that. And so I think they see the judicial reform as a way of pinpointing their protests. I've been working with others in Israel to try to come up with a compromise. I've spoken to the president of Israel, who's a wonderful man, Bougie Herzog, and of course, my 2 oldest friends in Israel are Benjamin Netanyahu, who I met in 1970 or so, and Aharon Barak, who was the man who made the judicial revolution, who I met in 1966. So we go back, 60 years. And they're all friends of mine. And I hope I can help bring people together and heal the wounds, because the wounds are terrible and they hurt the country. And the country has enough external enemies that it doesn't need to have enmity from within. So I hope there'll be some healing.
Well, yeah, I remember the first time I went to Israel, we went to the square where Rabin was killed. And they talked about how Rabin and Arafat shook hands publicly, which was like a watershed event. I mean, these were 2 soldiers that had been killing each other, with body counts on both sides for decades.
But there's a big difference. Rabin killed other soldiers, whereas Arafat killed little children and mothers and grandmothers and innocent civilians. So any comparison between Rabin and Arafat is a false comparison. It's like comparing Adolf Hitler to Dwight Eisenhower. There's no comparison.
Well, but the point is, these were 2 leaders that had been going at it that actually were getting older and knew that if they kept at it, their grandkids would have to suffer the consequences. They actually shook hands publicly, and there seems to have been some movement to the peace process. And then Rabin was killed by a Jewish kid, actually, in the middle of a public...
Whose family asked me to represent him, but I declined.
Okay, yeah. You wouldn't actually represent the guy who killed Rabin.
I wouldn't represent him because he wanted to defend himself on the ground that he did the right thing, and he didn't do the right thing, and I couldn't say that. So,
do you think if Rabin had actually survived the shooting, do you think that Israel would be a different place right now?
I don't know. It's hard to tell. Remember, it was Arafat who said no. It's the Palestinians who said no. The Israelis have offered peace on excellent terms since 1937. That's almost 100 years now. And the Palestinians have said no, 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 no. As Abi Ibn once said, the Palestinians don't know how to accept yes for an answer. And they just always say no, no, no.
Well, Alan Dershowitz, it was truly, truly an honor to sit down with you. You have such a storied history working on some of the biggest cases in the world, dealing with some of the most important and influential people on the planet. And, at the end of the day, doing so much work, there's going to be people that don't like certain decisions that you've made. They don't like some of the people that you've worked with and so forth. But I think by you sticking to your guns the entire time and focusing on the law as opposed to your personal beliefs and so forth, I think is very amicable. And I truly appreciate our time together.
I appreciate your good questions. Thank you so much. And someday you'll get back to Kiev where you were born, and maybe I'll visit Kiev again, and maybe there'll be peace in that very difficult part of the world. I would like to see that.
I would absolutely love that. I've never actually been to Kiev since I was 4 years old, and unfortunately I can't go right now. And yeah, that's actually a great way to end it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Be well.